Story number 1.
It was meant to be a quiet weekend, the kind that would let me clear my head. I had been feeling burnt out, work, life, everything. So when my friend suggested a winter camping trip to the mountains, I figured it would be the perfect escape. It was supposed to be just us three, me, Ben, and Laura. Ben was the seasoned outdoorsman of our group, always prepared for anything. Laura was the more cautious one, but she loved getting out of the city whenever she could. I liked the idea of disconnecting from everything for a couple of days, especially in the middle of January when the mountains were at their most remote. We drove up the night before the storm hit. The forecast had predicted some snow, but nothing too severe. Ben said we'd be fine, that he'd camped through worse. So we loaded up our gear and headed to a small secluded site near a mountain lake, about a 3-hour drive from the nearest town. The trailhead was quiet when we arrived, and the air felt cold and thin. It smelled like pine and ice, and the only sounds were the crunch of snow underfoot and the occasional gust of wind. Setting up camp wasn't too difficult. We had the tent, sleeping bags, food, and firewood. As night fell, the sky grew heavy with clouds and the snow began to fall. By the time we'd finished setting up, the first flakes were coming down in thick, wet clumps. We huddled around the fire, roasting marshmallows and drinking from thermoses of hot tea. "This is nice, right?" Laura said, her breath clouding in front of her. She was sitting on a log, her feet tucked into the snow. "Nice and peaceful," Ben grinned, stirring the fire. "Exactly what we need, a little solitude." The wind picked up as the night wore on, whipping through the trees. The fire crackled and popped, casting long shadows on the surrounding snow. It felt almost too quiet. The wind was relentless, but even that seemed muffled by the snowstorm. It was eerie, like the whole world was being swallowed up. By the time we turned in for the night, the storm had picked up in intensity. The wind howled around the tent, making the thin fabric shudder in the gusts. Inside, we were warm, huddled in our sleeping bags. The storm was still loud, but at least we were sheltered. Around midnight, I woke to a strange sound, a soft tapping, almost like someone knocking on the tent. I sat up, listening. The wind had died down for a moment, but the tapping persisted. I assumed it was just the sound of the storm, the snow falling against the tent fabric, but there was something off about it. It didn't sound natural. It wasn't rhythmic like the snow hitting the tent. It was uneven, like someone's knuckles gently tapping on the fabric. I turned to Ben, who was already awake, his eyes wide. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. He nodded. "Yeah? I don't like it." We both fell silent, straining to hear. The tapping continued for a few moments and then abruptly stopped. The quiet that followed felt even stranger. I reached over and shook Laura awake, and she groggily opened her eyes. "What's going on?" she asked, sitting up. "I heard something outside," I said, my voice tight. Before anyone could respond, there was a loud crash, like something heavy slamming into the tent. It shook the entire structure, and we all jumped. Ben immediately grabbed the flashlight and began scanning the area outside through the small window at the top of the tent. "Nothing," he muttered, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. He unzipped the tent a little and poked his head out into the storm. The wind whipped the snow into his face, but after a few moments, he came back inside, looking visibly rattled. "There's nothing out there," he said quickly, his voice sharp. "It was probably just a branch or something." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The snowstorm had turned into a full-blown blizzard, and the world outside was utterly white, thick with swirling snow. The storm was so intense that even the trees seemed to be swallowed by it, their shapes distorted in the haze. But something about the way the tent had shaken, it wasn't just the wind. It felt like something, or someone, had pushed it. "We should get some sleep," Ben said, after a few minutes of tense silence. "We'll check things out in the morning." The storm outside continued to rage through the night, and we eventually fell asleep. But I didn't sleep well. I kept imagining that someone was out there in the snow, watching us, waiting. I kept hearing noises, scratching at the tent, soft whispers in the wind. Each time I opened my eyes, I expected to see a face staring at me from the outside. But when I looked, there was nothing. Morning came slowly, and the snowstorm didn't let up. It was still heavily snowing when we crawled out of our sleeping bags, stiff from the cold. The fire had gone out overnight, leaving only a few embers. The world outside was completely blanketed in snow, the landscape eerily still. "All right," Ben said, trying to sound calm. "Let's pack up and head down the mountain. This storm isn't going anywhere." I nodded, but I still felt that nagging sense of unease. As we packed our things, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something move out of the corner of my eye. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like we weren't alone. Like there was something just beyond the trees, hidden by the snowstorm. Laura, who had been unusually quiet, spoke up. "Did anyone check the food? The supplies?" Ben frowned, his brow furrowing. "I brought the packs in last night." "Why?" She pointed to the fire pit, her eyes wide. "There are footprints." I looked over at the fire pit, and sure enough, the fresh snow surrounding the camp was marked by large, heavy footprints, like boots, but bigger, deeper. And they weren't our footprints. "Those aren't ours," I said, my voice low. "They weren't here last night." Ben turned pale. "I don't like this." The footprints circled the camp, moving in strange patterns around the tent. They weren't the kind of tracks that made sense. There were no straight lines, just odd, wandering paths that led right up to our tent and then stopped. There was no sign of anyone nearby. No sounds, no movement. "Could it be someone else camping out here?" Laura asked, though her voice didn't sound convincing. Ben shook his head. "This place is remote. No one would be out here in this weather unless they had a death wish." We stood there, staring at the tracks, the silence pressing in on us. The storm howled around us, but the world felt empty, too empty. Something about the scene felt wrong, like the storm had forced us into isolation, and now it was keeping us here. As if on cue, the wind picked up, and we heard something in the distance, a faint, raspy sound. A voice, barely audible, carried on the wind. It was too far to make out the words, but it was unmistakable. A voice, weak and broken. "Help me." It wasn't coming from the direction of the trail, nor from any of the nearby campsites. It sounded like it was coming from deep in the woods. I froze, my heart pounding. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Ben and Laura both nodded, their faces pale. "Yeah," Ben said quietly, his voice strained. "We need to get out of here, now." Without another word, we grabbed our bags and hurried down the mountain, our footsteps heavy in the snow. We didn't look back, not once. As we descended, the snowstorm continued to rage, but the haunting feeling that something was following us, that something had been watching us, stayed with me the entire way down. When we finally reached the trailhead and the safety of the truck, I looked up at the mountain one last time. It loomed dark and silent in the distance, the storm swirling around its peak. And in the distance, I thought I saw something. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching us. But when I blinked, it was gone. Story the end.
Story number 2.
It was supposed to be an unforgettable adventure, a weekend camping trip in the remote wilderness. Alex, Lena, and Mark, 3 friends who had shared countless hikes and bonfire stories, decided to push their limits this time by camping during an approaching snowstorm. They'd heard of the thrill from online forums. Snow camping in the dense woods could feel isolating, almost otherworldly. The trio packed their gear, including a sturdy tent, extra layers, food supplies, and a reliable propane heater. Lena had also brought an old compass, a family heirloom she swore by despite their modern GPS. "It's always good to have something you can count on when technology fails," she said, tapping its metal casing. They reached their destination in the early afternoon, just as gray clouds began rolling over the sky. The woods were eerily quiet, the thick pines muffling sound, as if the forest itself held its breath. They hiked for about 2 hours before finding a small clearing sheltered by a rocky outcrop. It seemed perfect, secluded, shielded from the wind, and distant from any roads or trails. By dusk, snow had started falling, soft and slow at first, but steadily gaining momentum. The tent was up, a small fire crackled, and the heater glowed faintly inside. They huddled together, swapping stories to pass the time. Mark, always the skeptic, chuckled when Lena mentioned the area's ghostly legends. "They always say these woods are haunted. The perfect setup for someone to disappear in the snow, right?" "Not funny," Alex said, glancing uneasily at the encroaching darkness. Lena shrugged. "The compass might keep us safe," she said, pulling it from her pocket. She twisted its lid open, revealing a faintly glowing needle. "It's been in my family for generations. My grandma used to say it doesn't just point north, It points away from danger. Sounds like something a grandma would say to keep kids entertained, Mark teased. As the wind howled outside the tent, their conversation dwindled. By the time they zipped into their sleeping bags, the snowstorm was raging. Alex awoke in the dead of night to a faint noise outside. At first, she thought it was the wind, but as she strained her ears, she realized it sounded more like footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching through the snow just beyond their tent. "Lena? Mark?" she whispered. Mark groaned groggily, but Lena was already sitting up, her face pale. "Do you hear that?" Lena asked. Mark muttered, "Probably an animal. Go back to sleep." But the footsteps didn't stop. They circled the tent, each step closer and heavier. Alex's breath hitched as the shadow of a figure passed by the thin nylon walls. Lena grabbed her compass and flicked it open. The needle spun wildly, refusing to settle. "That's not normal," she whispered. Alex unzipped the tent slightly, just enough to peek out. The cold bit her skin instantly, but she ignored it. The fire had long since gone out, and in the dim moonlight reflecting off the snow, she saw nothing. No tracks. No figure. Just a blanket of untouched snow. "I swear there was something," Alex stammered, zipping the tent shut again. Lena held up the compass. The needle had finally stopped spinning. It pointed due west. "Let's stay calm," Mark said, though his voice wavered. But the footsteps returned, louder this time, joined by faint whispers. The words were unintelligible, garbled as though carried by the wind. Lena clutched the compass tightly, her knuckles white. "Let's get out of here," she said. "Not in this storm," Mark argued. "We'd get lost or freeze to death." But Lena wasn't listening. She unzipped the tent and stepped out, compass in hand. "Lena, wait!" Alex called, scrambling after her. The snowstorm had transformed the forest into a monochrome void. Trees stood like shadowy sentinels, and the wind howled through their branches. Lena walked west, following the compass, her breath visible in the icy air. Mark reluctantly followed, grumbling about how they were making things worse. They walked for what felt like an eternity, the storm intensifying. The whispers grew louder, though they still couldn't make out the words. The group stumbled into a small clearing, where the snow seemed to fall slower, the wind quieter. In the center of the clearing stood an old wooden cabin. Its windows were shattered, its roof partially caved in, but it was shelter. "I don't remember seeing this on the map," Alex said, shivering. "Does it matter?" Mark snapped. "Let's just get out of the cold." They pushed the creaking door open and stepped inside. The air was stale, heavy with a musty scent. Broken furniture was scattered across the floor, and strange symbols were carved into the walls. "Cozy," Mark muttered, though his usual sarcasm sounded forced. Lena pulled out the compass. The needle spun violently again, faster than before. "This isn't right," she said, her voice trembling. Alex scanned the room and froze. In the corner near the collapsed fireplace were footprints in the dust. They led to a darkened doorway but didn't come back out. "Guys," she whispered, pointing. Mark's face went pale. "Maybe we should leave." But before they could move, the door slammed shut behind them. The whispers erupted into a cacophony, the words still unintelligible, but filled with malice. A figure emerged from the shadows of the darkened doorway. It was human-shaped but wrong, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its face was obscured by darkness, but its presence exuded an overwhelming sense of dread. Lena held up the compass like a talisman. The needle stopped spinning and pointed directly at the figure. "Get back!" she screamed, though her voice cracked. The figure paused, then tilted its head unnaturally, as if curious. "Run!" Alex yelled, grabbing Lena's arm. They bolted out of the cabin, the storm almost welcoming compared to what they had just seen. The whispers followed them, growing louder, more insistent. Lena led the way, clutching the compass tightly. The needle now pointed north, and she trusted it blindly. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs ached. When they finally stopped, the whispers had faded and the storm had begun to subside. But something was wrong. The forest looked unfamiliar, alien. The trees were twisted, their branches clawing at the sky. The snow beneath their feet was stained dark, as though mixed with ash. Lena looked at the compass. The needle was still pointing north, but her expression was grim. I think we're not where we were before," she said. "What does that mean?" Mark demanded, panic creeping into his voice. "I don't know," Lena admitted, tears welling in her eyes. Before anyone could respond, the whispers returned, closer than ever. They never made it out of the woods.
Story number 3.
It was mid-January when Eric, Jenna, and Dave decided to go winter camping. The three friends had been seasoned hikers for years, tackling everything from rocky trails to dense forests, but none of them had braved a snowstorm before. It was Jenna's idea, a challenge to shake off the monotony of their usual hikes and to see if they could endure the raw wilderness in winter's grip. The forecast predicted heavy snow over the weekend, and that only made it more thrilling for them. They packed the essentials, thermal gear, a four-season tent, extra food, and a satellite phone for emergencies. Eric brought his DSLR, determined to capture the beauty of a snowstorm in the forest. Jenna carried a hand-crank lantern and her trusty multi-tool, while Dave packed his survival knife and a flask of whiskey to keep us warm, he joked. The trailhead was about a 3-hour drive from the city. They arrived in the late morning, their car the only one in the parking lot. The snow had already begun to fall in gentle flakes, dusting the trees and blanketing the ground in pristine white. The silence of the forest was almost oppressive, broken only by the crunch of their boots as they hiked deeper into the woods. After 3 miles, they found a suitable clearing beside a frozen lake. The dense canopy of pines offered some shelter from the wind, and the view was stunning, a vast, untouched expanse of white stretching to the horizon. They set up camp quickly, knowing the storm would worsen by nightfall. By the time darkness fell, the snowstorm was in full swing. Wind howled through the trees, shaking the branches and sending flurries in every direction. Inside the tent, the trio huddled together, laughing and sharing stories as the propane heater radiated warmth. The storm outside felt distant, almost like background noise to their camaraderie. It was around midnight when Eric first heard it, a faint tapping sound, almost like fingernails against glass. He sat up, straining his ears. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. Jenna and Dave stopped talking. At first, there was nothing but the wind. Then, faintly, the tapping came again. It was irregular, sporadic, and seemed to be coming from the direction of the lake. "It's probably a tree branch hitting the ice," Jenna said, though her voice lacked conviction. Eric wasn't so sure. He grabbed his flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to shine it outside. Snow whipped through the air, but he could see the lake clearly. The surface was still and smooth, undisturbed by branches or debris. "Nothing," he said, though he couldn't shake the unease settling in his chest. The three tried to go back to sleep, but the tapping persisted. Sometimes it was soft, almost imperceptible. Other times, it was sharp and insistent, like someone knocking to be let in. By 2 a.m., Jenna had had enough. "Let's just check it out," she said, pulling on her coat. "Maybe it's an animal or something." Reluctantly, Eric and Dave followed. Armed with flashlights and a lantern, they trudged through the snow toward the lake. The storm had quieted slightly, and the moon cast an eerie glow over the frozen expanse. As they neared the lake, the tapping stopped. They stood at the edge, their breath visible in the frigid air. The ice was smooth and untouched, with no signs of cracks or disturbances. "This is pointless," Dave said, shivering. Just as they turned to head back, Eric froze. "Wait," he said, pointing toward the center of the lake. A figure stood there, barely visible in the moonlight. It was motionless, shrouded in shadow, its features obscured by the storm's lingering mist. Is that someone?" Jenna whispered. "It can't be," Dave said. "No one else is out here." Eric raised his flashlight, but the beam barely reached the figure. "Hello?" he called. No response. "Maybe they need help," Jenna said, though her voice trembled. Dave grabbed her arm. "No, something's wrong." Before anyone could argue, the figure moved. It didn't walk or run. It glided, smooth and unnatural, like a shadow cast across the ice. "Go," Eric said, his voice tight with panic. They bolted back to the tent, their boots slipping on the snow. The wind picked up again, howling like a banshee as they dove inside and zipped the door shut. "What the hell was that?" Jenna whispered, her face pale. Eric shook his head, his hands trembling. "I don't know. It wasn't human." Dave, usually the skeptic, was silent, his eyes fixed on the tent's walls as if expecting the figure to appear at any moment. The tapping returned, louder this time. It wasn't coming from the lake, it was right outside the tent. "Don't open it," Jenna said, clutching the lantern. Eric nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. The tapping grew more insistent, joined by a faint whispering. The words were indecipherable, but they carried a chilling tone, like a distant voice carried on the wind. The lantern flickered, casting shadows that danced ominously across the tent. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became an almost deafening cacophony. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The trio sat in stunned silence, the only sound their ragged breathing. "Is it gone?" Jenna asked. Eric reached for the zipper, ignoring her protests. He opened the tent flap just enough to peek outside. The snow had stopped falling, and the forest was eerily still. But the figure was there, standing just 10 feet away, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. Its face was blank, featureless, and yet Eric felt its gaze pierce through him. He scrambled back, his voice caught in his throat. "It's here," he finally managed to choke out. The figure moved closer, its gliding motion sending a wave of terror through all three. Jenna grabbed the lantern and cranked it furiously, flooding the tent with light. The figure stopped. For a moment, it seemed to waver, as if unsure of itself. "Don't stop," Dave said, his voice trembling. Jenna kept cranking until her arm ached, the lantern's glow growing brighter and brighter. The figure let out a low, guttural sound, almost like a growl, and then it was gone, vanishing into the darkness as if it had never been there. The rest of the night passed in tense silence. None of them dared to sleep. By dawn, the storm had cleared, and the forest seemed almost serene, as if mocking their terror. They packed up in record time, eager to leave. As they hiked back to the car, Eric glanced over his shoulder repeatedly, half expecting the figure to follow. When they reached the parking lot, their car was covered in a thick layer of snow. Dave brushed off the windshield and froze. "What is it?" Jenna asked. He pointed to the glass, his hand shaking. There, etched into the frost, were 3 words: "Don't come back." Story the end.
Story number 4.
The snowstorm was worse than we'd expected, but it was too late to turn back. The 3 of us, Mia, Eric, and I, had planned this trip for weeks, a winter camping adventure in the Rockies. The forecast had promised light snow, but by the time we reached the campsite, the flurries had transformed into a heavy, blinding storm. Eric was the outdoorsman among us, confident in his survival skills. "We'll be fine," he said, brushing snow from his jacket as we set up our tents near the edge of a frozen lake. "This'll pass by morning." Mia wasn't so sure. She shivered as she helped me secure the stakes in the ground, her breath fogging in the icy air. "What if it doesn't? What if we're stuck out here?" I tried to lighten the mood. "Hey, we've got Eric. He's basically Bear Grylls, right?" Eric grinned, but Mia didn't laugh. She glanced nervously at the dense forest surrounding us. The snow-covered pines loomed like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with ice. I didn't blame her for being uneasy. There was something about the storm that felt off. By the time we got a fire going, it was pitch dark. The wind howled through the trees, and the snow fell so thickly that it seemed to muffle all other sounds. We huddled close to the flames, eating canned soup and joking half-heartedly to keep our spirits up. It was just after 9 p.m. when we heard the first sound, a long, low whistle, rising and falling like a mournful tune. It carried on the wind, faint but distinct. "What the hell was that?" Mia whispered, clutching her mug of soup. "Probably just the wind," Eric said, though he didn't sound convinced. He poked at the fire, his jaw tight. The whistle came again, closer this time. It wasn't the kind of sound the wind makes. It was too deliberate, too human. "I think someone's out there," I said, standing and peering into the darkness. The flashlight in my hand barely penetrated the swirling snow. "Who would be out here in this storm?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. Eric frowned. "Maybe someone lost their way. I'll check it out." "No," Mia said quickly. "We should stay together." Eric hesitated, then nodded. "All right, let's all go. Stay close." We left the warmth of the fire and followed the sound, our flashlights cutting narrow beams through the storm. The whistling led us deeper into the woods, growing louder and more erratic. It didn't sound like a tune anymore. It was jagged, broken, almost like laughter. I stopped. "Guys, I don't think this is a good idea." Eric turned back, his expression serious. "If someone's out here, they could be in trouble. We can't just ignore it." Mia grabbed my arm. "I don't like this. Let's just go back to camp." But before we could decide, the whistling stopped. The sudden silence was unnerving, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. "Do you hear that?" Eric asked, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Hear what?" I whispered. "Footsteps." We all stood frozen, straining to listen. At first I didn't hear anything. Then, faintly, the crunch of snow, slow, deliberate steps coming toward us. "Hello?" Eric called, his voice steady despite the tension in his shoulders. "Is someone there?" No response, just the sound of footsteps, closer now. "Maybe it's an animal," I said, though I didn't believe it. The steps were too measured, too deliberate. Then the footsteps stopped. Eric raised his flashlight, sweeping it across the trees. The beam caught something, a figure standing just beyond the reach of the light. "Hey!" Eric called. "Do you need help?" The figure didn't move. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its outline was blurry, as if the storm itself was clinging to it. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the snow. Eric took a step forward. "Are you okay?" "Don't," Mia said, her voice shaking. "Something's wrong." The figure tilted its head as if studying us. Then it turned and vanished into the trees. Not walked, vanished. We stood in stunned silence, the forest closing in around us. Eric finally broke the spell. "Let's go back." No one argued. By the time we reached the campsite, the fire was out, buried under fresh snow. The storm had intensified, and our tent sagged under the weight of it. We quickly ducked inside Eric's larger tent, all three of us crammed together, too shaken to sleep. "What was that thing?" Mia whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. Eric shook his head. "I don't know. Maybe it was a trick of the light." I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the image of that figure, its impossible stillness, the way it had disappeared. The night dragged on. The wind howled, and the temperature dropped. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke to Mia shaking me, her face pale and terrified. "Do you hear it?" she whispered. I sat up, my heart pounding. At first, I didn't know what she meant. Then I heard it, a faint scratching sound, like nails on fabric. It was coming from outside the tent. Eric was already awake, his flashlight in hand. He unzipped the tent just enough to shine the beam outside. Snow whipped past, but there was nothing there. The scratching stopped. "It's probably just branches," Eric said, though his hand trembled as he zipped the tent shut. We tried to settle back down, but the scratching started again, louder this time. And then came the whistle, low and mournful, right outside the tent. Mia clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "It's here," she whispered. Eric grabbed his knife, his jaw set. "Stay here," he said, unzipping the tent before we could stop him. "Eric, no," Mia cried, but he was already outside. We waited, every second stretching into eternity. The storm raged and the whistling continued, circling the tent. Then Eric screamed. It wasn't a yell for help, it was pure terror, cut off abruptly. "Eric!" I shouted, scrambling out of the tent. He was gone. His flashlight lay in the snow, its beam pointing uselessly at the ground. The snow around it was undisturbed. No tracks, no sign of a struggle. "Where is he?" Mia sobbed, grabbing my arm. "I don't know," I said, my voice cracking. "We need to go. Now." We didn't bother packing. We grabbed what we could and ran, stumbling through the snow, the storm swallowing us whole. The whistling followed, growing louder, more erratic. Shadows flickered in the corners of my vision, but when I turned, there was nothing there. Nothing. Mia screamed, and I spun around to see her collapse, clutching her ankle. "I twisted it," she cried. I helped her up, half carrying her as we pushed forward. The forest seemed endless, the trees closing in, their branches like skeletal hands. Then we saw the cabin. It stood in a small clearing, its roof sagging under the weight of snow. Smoke curled weakly from the chimney, and a faint light glowed in the window. "We have to try," I said, dragging Mia toward it. The door creaked as we pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick and stale, but it was warmer than outside. A fire burned in the hearth, though there was no sign of who had started it. "We can wait here," I said, helping Mia onto a rickety chair. "Just until the storm lets up." She nodded, her face pale and drawn. I closed the door, bolting it shut, and turned to explore the cabin. That's when I saw the photographs. They were pinned to the walls, dozens of them, their edges yellowed with age. Each one showed the same thing, a campsite in the snow, tents sagging under the weight of a storm, a frozen lake in the background. Our campsite. In the corner of each photo was the same figure, the tall, blurry shape we had seen in the woods. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. Behind me, Mia gasped. "Look." She was staring at the window. A handprint was pressed against the frosted glass, long fingers splayed wide. It wasn't there when we came in. The whistling started again, louder than ever, surrounding the cabin. And then the door creaked open. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The snowstorm started earlier than expected. By the time Mike, Rachel, and Tyler reached their campsite deep in the woods, the soft flurries had turned into an unforgiving blizzard. Thick snow blanketed the ground, muffling their footsteps, and the wind carried an icy bite that cut through even their best thermal layers. "This'll pass by morning," Mike said, his words barely audible over the wind. He was always the optimist, the one who believed nothing could ruin a good adventure. Rachel didn't share his enthusiasm. She adjusted her scarf, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "We should have turned back when it started picking up," she muttered. "Too late now," Tyler added, dumping their packs in the clearing. "Let's just get the tent up before it gets worse." It was already worse. The temperature was dropping fast, and the forest had grown unnervingly quiet, save for the howling wind. The dense pines surrounding them swayed, their snow-laden branches groaning under the weight. The three worked quickly, pitching the tent and securing their supplies. Tyler lit a small propane heater inside, while Mike set up their sleeping bags. By the time they crawled in, their faces were red from the cold, their fingers numb. "See? Cozy," Mike said with a grin, though even he looked uneasy. The tent walls flapped in the wind, and the storm raged on outside. They ate in silence, the wind howling like a wild animal. Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She kept glancing at the thin fabric of the tent walls, expecting to see shadows moving outside. "You're jumpy," Tyler said, noticing her unease. "It's just too quiet. Besides the wind, I mean." Mike shrugged. "That's what makes it cool. We're miles from anyone else. Total isolation." Rachel didn't find that comforting. Sometime in the night, Rachel woke up. The wind had calmed a little, but a strange sound had taken its place. A soft, rhythmic crunching like footsteps in the snow. She held her breath, straining to hear. The sound grew louder, coming closer to the tent. "Mike," she whispered, shaking him awake. "What?" he mumbled groggy. "Do you hear that?" The crunching stopped. Tyler stirred, sitting up. "What's going on?" "Footsteps," Rachel said, her voice barely audible. Mike frowned, grabbing his flashlight. He unzipped the tent slightly and shone the beam outside. The light caught the swirling snow, but there was nothing else. "No tracks," he said, zipping the tent back up. "It's probably an animal," Tyler offered. Rachel shook her head. It sounded human. The three sat in silence, listening. For a while, there was nothing but the wind. Then, faintly, the crunching started again, circling the tent. By dawn, the storm had eased, but the unease lingered. They emerged from the tent to find the world transformed. Snow piled high around them, the forest an endless sea of white. "I told you it was probably an animal," Mike said, trying to lighten the mood. Rachel wasn't convinced. She pointed to the ground around their tent. "Where are the tracks, then?" The fresh snow was pristine, undisturbed. No footprints, no signs of movement. Tyler frowned. "Maybe the wind covered them up." Rachel didn't respond. Her gut told her something was wrong. They decided to stay one more night, mostly at Mike's insistence. The sky was clear now, the storm a distant memory, but Rachel couldn't shake her unease. As the sun set, the temperature plummeted again. They huddled inside the tent, the propane heater humming softly. Tyler passed around a flask of whiskey, trying to lift everyone's spirits. "To surviving the storm," he said with a grin. They drank, laughed, and, for a moment, the tension eased. But as the hours passed and the forest grew darker, the strange feeling returned. Around midnight, the footsteps came back. This time, all three of them heard it. Clear, deliberate crunching, circling the tent. Mike grabbed his flashlight. "I'm going out there." "Don't," Rachel said, grabbing his arm. "It's probably just a deer or something." "It's not a deer," she snapped, her voice trembling. Mike hesitated but unzipped the tent anyway. He stepped outside, shining the light in every direction. "Anything?" Tyler asked from inside. Mike didn't answer. "Mike?" Rachel called. Still nothing. Heart pounding, Rachel crawled to the tent entrance and peered out. Mike stood a few feet away, his flashlight pointed at the edge of the clearing. "Mike, what is it?" "Tracks," he said, his voice flat. She stepped outside, Tyler close behind. In the snow, just beyond the clearing, were footprints. They were deep, spaced like someone walking slowly, someone barefoot. "Who the hell would be out here barefoot?" Tyler whispered. Mike followed the tracks with his flashlight. They led toward the tree line, then stopped abruptly. No return tracks, no sign of anyone leaving. "That's not possible," Rachel said, her voice barely audible. Mike shook his head, turning back toward the tent. Let's just go inside. None of them slept. The footsteps returned sporadically, sometimes close, sometimes distant. Once they heard faint whispering, though they couldn't make out the words. By dawn, they decided to leave. Whatever was out there, they didn't want to stay another night to find out. They packed in silence, the weight of the previous night hanging heavy over them. As they hiked back, the forest seemed darker, more oppressive. Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. When they finally reached the car, they were exhausted but relieved. Tyler threw his pack in the trunk and slammed it shut. "Let's never do this again," he said. Rachel nodded, climbing into the passenger seat. Mike started the car, the engine struggling to turn over in the cold. As they pulled out of the parking lot, Rachel glanced out the window. At the edge of the trees, half hidden in the shadows, stood a figure. It didn't move, didn't wave, just stood there watching. She didn't say anything. Story? The end.